Let's talk about biology and eating, an incredibly interesting and complicated topic. And by the time we're done with this class, I hope that you, as I am, will be impressed with just how many factors are affecting what people choose to eat, how much they eat, the way they regulate their body weight, intake of certain nutrients, and the like. There are all these interesting, some cases redundant systems that are affecting what people eat. Then we're going to take the completely opposite tack next week, where, in the next class on Monday, we're going to begin by talking about addiction, which is really a carryover from this, food and addiction, but there's just not enough time to cram it into this lecture. And then we're going to move on to culture and how culture affects eating. And so you could make a strong argument that eating is driven almost entirely by biology, or you could also make the argument that it's driven almost entirely by culture, but where it gets extremely interesting is where the two intersect and how the two affect one another. So we'll talk about more of the biology today. Some years ago, I was talking to a person who worked for M&M Mars, big candy company, of course, and two of their biggest selling products are Three Musketeers and Snickers candy bars. And this individual told me that one of them is preferred much more by adults and the other preferred much more by children. And there are properties that I'll ask you about in a minute that distinguish why one is more attractive to children and the other by adults. So let's try out the clickers today. Which do you think is more attractive to the kids? The Three Musketeers. Oh, you know what I need to do? I'm sorry. I need to boot this up through another program. I apologize. See, I was so worried we had so much to do today that I forgot to boot this up. Come on now. Okay. Okay, this time it should work. Now you've had a chance to think about it as well. All right, so let's see if the technology is correct. Okay, so what do kids prefer? The Three Musketeers or the Snickers? So go ahead and log in. Make sure the green light goes on. Okay. So people are still voting, it appears. All right, so let's stop the voting now and see if this, yep. So 49% of you said Three Musketeers, 51% says Snickers. So almost a dead heat there. Well, the answer is the kids prefer the Three Musketeers. Adults prefer the Snickers. Who can guess why that might be? Yes? All right, you got the right answer, that it's the peanuts that make the difference. What is it about the peanuts, do you think, that make adults like it and kids not? I mean, kids like peanut butter, after all. Yeah, texture is the answer. The peanuts introduce a texture like a Nestle's Crunch bar would have. Kids tend to like uniformity in texture and tend not to like extra things thrown in that confuse them with the texture, whereas adults do like things that have texture. So as much as the adults may like the taste of the peanuts in that kind of a thing, it's really the texture that makes them like that particular candy bar. So that's one interesting little sensory property of foods that will affect who likes what. So today we're going to talk about how biology affects a number of things. And these are very interesting questions. How does biology affect taste? Which foods do we prefer and not? We've talked about that to some extent before. How does it affect mood? People seek out foods when they're feeling depressed, when they're feeling anxious, when they're feeling lonely. And it's different for some people. How is biology affecting that? And then, of course, these other things are very important as well. Just to make a brief distinction on the third bullet point about hunger and satiety, you probably know what those terms mean. Hunger is pretty obvious. Satiety refers to how full a person feels and when eating shuts off once it starts. And we'll come back and talk about some animal studies that distinguish hunger and satiety, human studies as well. So today we're going to talk about taste, and I'm going to introduce this concept that was developed by a former Yale researcher named Linda Bartoshuk on super tasting. We're going to talk about the physiology of eating, or what the animal researchers call feeding. Not sure why it's feeding in animals and eating in humans, but that's the way it is. We'll talk about energy balance in the body and how body weight gets affected, the genetics of these things, and then we'll end with this discussion of something interesting called taste aversions. First of all, taste. There's sort of this basic biology 101 that where people get a sense that there are different sensory properties of taste and different parts of the tongue that perceive these tastes. And this has been known for years, and it's easy to map out the biology of this kind of thing. And this is a pretty simplistic version of it. But there's some very interesting work that's taken this to a new level. But you can see how taste has such a profound effect on people and what it does to them. And you see it in facial expressions. So you see somebody eating something sweet, fatty that they enjoy, and you get a look like that. Somebody eats something they don't like, and you get a look like that. And so, you know, if you just saw this face on the right, and you asked people to say, well, what do you think is happening with this man? You know, people could say, well, he saw something disgusting or he tasted something disgusting. And that word disgust is pretty interesting in this context. But it shows up in facial expressions. Now, here's the concept of super tasting. This researcher, Linda Bartoshuk, a terrific scientist who was here at Yale for many years and then moved to the University of Florida, has looked at the way the tongue and the body perceives tastes of foods. And her desire, one of her scientific desires, is to map out the biology of these things and to understand how taste affects biology and how biology affects taste. So she's really, as I said, a very fine researcher. Well, one of the things that she's done is work with something called PROPE. And PROPE is the abbreviation for this compound that you see on the bottom, propyl uracil. It got which is a variation of something that got discovered in 1931 by a chemist named Fox. He was working with that particular compound that you see in the top bullet point there, and it exploded in his lab. And what happened is he found that the associate got some of this in his mouth, tasted it as quite bitter, but he didn't taste it at all. And he got interested in why would this be the case? Why would the two of them have the same thing in their mouth but taste it much differently? And it wasn't even so much that one liked it and the other one didn't. One of them couldn't even detect it. And so that got picked up by scientists, including Bartoshuk, who started looking at this and have used this compound, the PROPE, in many, many interesting studies. And what they do is they put a little bit of this on a little piece of paper, and you put the paper on your tongue and keep it in your mouth for just a short time. The population breaks down into three groups. There are groups who can't even detect it at all. They're called the non-tasters. There's some people who experience it as mildly bitter. Those are the medium tasters. And then the super tasters are people who experience it as extremely bitter. And the population breaks down about like this: quarter of people at the extremes and 50% of people in the middle. The interesting comparison is between the non-tasters and the super tasters. And what Bartoshuk has done is mapped out the tongue physiology on this. And there's a part of the tongue shown in this little picture here of where there's a high density of these things called fungiform papilla. And Bartoshuk and others have shown that the ability to detect this particular chemical resides in that part of the tongue. And that what you do is just put a little dye on the tongue, and then you take a picture of it, and you can actually count, once it's magnified, the number of these fungiform papilla. And if you look at the picture, but the comparison of tasters and non-tasters, you get something like this. So at that part of the tongue, each of those white dots would represent one of the fungiform papilla. The super tasters, again, the ones who detect that chemical as very bitter, look like that. So really quite a difference. So if you get this interesting sense between 25% of the population looks like that, 25% looks like the top slide, and you could see how people, to the extent this is related to food preferences, how the tongue people are born with, and there's probably related physiology elsewhere in the body to that, how that's going to affect what people eat. Now what Linda Bartoshuk has found is that The people who are the super tasters in that 25% group, and to a lesser extent, but still true, of that 50% in the middle, the larger group, they perceive an intense burn from things that are considered food irritants. And they also perceive the most intense sweetness from sweet foods. And so bitter vegetables like broccoli and cauliflower, for example, are experienced as very bitter by that 25% of the population, the super tasters. The non-tasters don't experience them as bitter or difficult at all. And so you can imagine how easy it is for the non-tasters to eat those kind of things and how difficult it is for the super tasters to eat those. And it also has relationships to desire for fat. But the sweetness is interesting too. If Linda were here doing a demonstration, she would have you all put this on your tongue, see which group you happen to fall in, give you a little butterscotch candy, and then have you rate how sweet it is and how pleasant that taste is. And she could predict in advance who would experience it as very sweet and very pleasant, depending on whether you were a super taster or not, with the super tasters experiencing the sweetness as very desirable and very powerful sensory experience. So coupled together is this turn off to the irritants, the fresh fruits and vegetables, not fruits so much because they're sweet, but the bitter vegetables, and then a liking for sweet things. And of course, this would affect dietary preferences and therefore health. So this is a very interesting phenomenon that she has found. And the way she puts it in more generic terms is this, that the super tasters live in this neon world of taste where everything is bright and vivid and bold and potent, whereas the non-tasters live in this pastel world where they're not experiencing as much preference for sweets nor the aversion to the bitter vegetables and things. And so you would expect from that point of view for the super tasters to have greater problems with weight, greater problems with diet related to health than is the case with the non-tasters. So that begins to give you a sense of what's involved just with the taste part of the equation. Now let's talk about the physiology of eating. Now, I'm going to break this down for you. It took me a lot of time to uncouple all the little pieces in this graph, but I'm going to show it to you piece by piece. But this is one conceptualization of all the factors that are affecting taste and affecting what people eat. And central to this are central signals. Those would be the brain and the central nervous system. And then over here are peripheral signals that happen outside the brain, mainly from the body's organs. So let's break this down and take it piece by piece and show you how it might all fall together. So let's start with the brain. First of all, the brain and its subsequent physiological reaction is affected by external factors. So the fact that you might seek out certain foods to soothe yourself when you're stressed means that there are external things going on that make certain foods more desirable to you at some times than others. That would be an example. But there are other things like, what's going on in the environment, as we used as an example before. You just had a nice meal at a restaurant, you don't feel like you could eat one more calorie, here comes a dessert cart, and all of a sudden you're hungry again. Those are external factors that affect the brain and therefore the physiology. There are central signals and peripheral signals, as I mentioned before. Let's look at the central signals first. There are signals that are going on in the brain, some of which stimulate eating and others inhibit eating. That's the hunger and satiety that we mentioned a moment ago. And these things directly affect food intake. How much food intake, what people eat and what kind of foods they eat have a feedback loop to the brain that affects subsequent intake. So you get this loop going on. So from a common sense point of view, if somebody eats a lot of food, then the feedback loop would go to the brain that I've had enough, it's time to stop. And there are signals, or I haven't had enough and I need to eat more. And these central signals that stimulate or inhibit eating fall into that category. So there are a certain number of chemicals in the body that stimulate eating, certain ones that decrease eating, and I'll just point out a few of these. You don't really need to know what these are, but I'll point out just a few as examples. One would be the NPY, which stands for neuropeptide Y, and the 5-HT, which is something that you will hear more of in the common language, is serotonin. And it's very interesting how these two things affect eating, and the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are a class of drugs mainly used for depression, So the Prozac and drugs like that are SSRI drugs. Those drugs once they were discovered, the laboratory scientists found in the initial animal studies, just looking at whether these drugs were safe or not for the health of the animals, found out that the animals lost weight, and there was some suppression of appetite. So then scientists said, well, boy, if you think there's a market for depression, just think about the market for weight loss. And there was some marketing of these drugs for that at one point, but they haven't really worked out that well. But you can see how these things are affecting food intake, feedback loops to the brain. So people eat, how much they eat is determined partly by some of these things. What they eat then affects those things, and you get the feedback loop going on. So there's what happens between what people eat and then subsequently what their brain tells them to eat is a very interesting part of the equation. And that's where some of the peripheral signals come in. So your body takes in food, it senses that you've had nutrients of one sort or another, a series of metabolic processes kick in, and those affect what happens to the brain subsequently. And here's some of the things that fall in those. Those are the peripheral signals. Excuse me. So these are some of the compounds that determine that are the peripheral signals. So we talked about blood glucose last week or on Monday when we talked about the glycemic index. So you eat food, your blood sugar goes up, that's the blood glucose goes up, and that affects the brain. And we talked about how hunger, and there was the spike with the high glycemic index foods, the lower spike with low glycemic index foods. So the glucose that you see over here is one example of that. But insulin is also very involved, as you might imagine. And then hormones that get talked about more in the press, ghrelin and leptin are important players here. And then cortisol, which is a stress hormone, is a player as well. So these act through organs. It's the effect of food on different organ systems in the body that create the release or the suppression of these things. So first, the liver is involved in the glucose. So food intake will affect the liver. That will determine the blood glucose levels. You have the gastrointestinal tract involved as well. So of course your small and large intestine and the stomach are involved here, and those will affect these things, especially insulin and ghrelin. Then you have the adipose tissue. The fat cells are involved because they're perceiving signals from the incoming food. Those affect leptin. And then you have adrenal glands that affect the cortisol. And cortisol, a stress hormone, is an interesting player here. One of your teaching fellows, Allie Crum, will be talking about some of the work that she's doing in a later class, and she's doing some work that involves a number of these things. Very interesting study that looks at the intersection of psychology and perceptions and biology. So these things then have signals that would either increase or decrease eating, and they feed back to the brain in that kind of way. So you put all this system together and you get things like this. So this is what happens after food is consumed. And then it goes back to the brain, and then that affects what people eat subsequently. If you put it all together, you have this, what seemed like a perplexing picture to begin with. Still might be perplexing, but what I'm hoping that you take away from this is an appreciation for how many parts of the body are affected when people eat food, how the brain is an important player in what people choose to eat in the beginning, and how all these feedback loops are occurring. And so it's even more complicated than this, but this is an interesting start at looking at the picture. Let's look at some factors that affect short-term food intake. Now, long-term food intake, how much people are eating overall, is affected by some overlapping, but also different factors. But let's talk about what people eat in the short term, like at a given meal, at a given point in time. There are different ways scientists have looked at this. And they've measured different patterns of what people eat by breaking things down into this way. What factors determine whether a meal gets started? What determines whether you start eating at a given point? When do you become hungry? What triggers some awareness in your mind that you're ready to eat? And that would determine meal initiation or snack initiation or whatever. The size of the meal, of course, is an important factor. And there are real differences here between the meal initiation and the meal size, and then the meal termination comes in here as well. There have been very interesting studies over the years using different drugs with animals to look at what it does to their appetite. And of course, the pharmaceutical companies have done, thousands and thousands of these studies in hope of finding drugs that will help people with their eating and their weight. But when you do studies with animals, you find that some drugs affect the initiation of a meal. They affect hunger. So how likely is it for the animal or a human to start eating? And that would be the hunger part of it. Some drugs selectively affect that, but they don't affect how much is eaten once the meal starts. And so what might go up then is the interval between meals, or even how many meals are eaten, but what's eaten during a meal is untouched by these drugs. Then there are a whole other class of drugs that affect satiety. The interval between meals remains untouched. The likelihood of initiating a meal remains untouched, but how much the organism eats once the meal starts is highly affected by the drug. And so that leads us to think that when people have problems controlling their eating, there could be some people who have disorders of hunger, or not disorders necessarily, because that makes it too clinical, but problems with hunger, and other people might have problems with satiety. So think in your own experience, when there are times when you're eating things you don't think you should eat, or you're eating more than you think you should eat, what's going on? Is it the hunger? Do you just want to eat all the time, or you want to eat more often? Or are you eating at regular times, but you're just having trouble eating as much as you think you should, and you overdo it? And there could be combinations of these things. But that's one interesting broad cut at this whole issue. And there are things that affect all of these. So, for example, hunger, the biological experience of hunger, will affect both meal initiation and meal size. The appetite, which is what a person's desire is for particular nutrients or particular foods, will affect both of these things as well. Satiety, which is the sense of feeling full, as I mentioned, will affect when a meal terminates, when the next meal will start, because that feeling of full will only last so long, and then of course that will affect the meal frequency. And then there's a concept that I'm going to explain in a minute called sensory-specific satiety that will affect meal size and meal termination. So when you add all these things up, you have this array of arrows going every which way. So again, you can get a sense of how the biology affects actual eating patterns in this very interesting network of effects. And they come together in very interesting ways. Let me tell you what sensory-specific satiety is in a minute, but before we do that, I'm going to have you use your clickers and to get your sense of another issue. Here's a product called Munchies. Let's put this into a specific context of a food. Frito-Lay, I don't know how long ago, at least a couple years or more, introduced a line of snack products called Munchies, and there was one in particular in the chartreuse bag that was oriented toward kids. So it's Munchies Kids Mix. And each of these Munchies products takes a series of things that Frito-Lay may sell anyway and puts them into a combination, into a mix. Now this one in particular, this Munchies Kids Mix, if you look at the back of the bag, here's what's put together in this mix. So it's Rolled Gold pretzels, it's Captain Crunch cereal, right under that. It's Doritos, it's popcorn, Smart Food popcorn, it's Cheetos, the cheese ball things, and then it's M&M type candies. So these are what are going into this particular snack mix. Now, is this snack mix good or not good for kids compared to what they might be eating otherwise, which might just be one of these things put together, put in a bag. So. I talked to you in a little minute about how the Munchies is being marketed. And Frito-Lay has several different messages on the bag that make it look like it's going to be a healthier product for kids. And that there's something somehow good about this compared to the normal things. But let's compare what would happen here. So I'd like you to use your clickers, and on the next slide, to see whether you think that if you just sat kids down in a, whatever kind of a setting and gave them unlimited amounts of that and unlimited amounts of that, what they would eat more of and why. So let's see how your intuition works here. And there's something that I mentioned in an earlier class that was kind of a tip-off as to the answer here. So the question is, how many of you believe that people would eat more Munchies? How many of you believe they would eat more Cheetos? Or how many believe it would be the same? So vote 1, 2, or 3 here. Okay. Few people still voting. More Munchies, more Cheetos, or the same? Okay, let's look at the graph. See what you guys said. Okay, 78% of you said that it was more Munchies. Okay, why would that be? Okay, variety. That was the tip-off, so I'm glad you guys remembered that. It was nice you were paying attention early that morning. So variety is one issue, and variety connects with this concept of sensory-specific satiety that I'd now like to explain. Sensory-specific satiety is what happens when an organism eats the same food over and over. And basically what it means is that the palatability or the likability of certain foods and desire for them will go down more than for foods that are not eaten. Okay? And presumably this is the evolutionary response to the body's need for a variety of nutrients. So if you eat the same thing over and over again, even though you might really like it, you're only getting certain nutrients, you're being deprived of others, and hence the body sends out this signal that, hey, I've had enough of that stuff, it's time to move on to something else. That's the sensory-specific satiety concept, and it's been studied a lot over the years. There's a researcher at Penn State named Barbara Rolls, and I'll discuss some of her work later on in a different context, but she has done some terrific studies on sensory-specific satiety. And the environment thwarts sensory-specific satiety, doesn't it? So again, if we look back to when I was a boy and think about when you guys were kids, the number of food choices available went way up. So there's not only the number of opportunities to eat has gone way up, because there's food, as we mentioned before, in the gas stations and the drugstores and schools and everywhere else, but the variety of foods has gone up. And so each year, the food industry introduces several thousand new food products. Some of them fall out of the market, but some of them don't, and as a consequence, the number of options available today in a supermarket or a convenience store is way, way higher than it used to be. And you think of things like this, a restaurant like the Cheesecake Factory with an enormous menu, or you go to a diner, they have enormous menus. So any place you go, if you go to a restaurant and they had like 6 choices, you'd think you were getting gypped and there was something wrong with this place because they don't have enough choices. And then of course you've got the variety in places like this. It's happening around the world where you have many, many choices of things in supermarkets. In fact, one thing that people notice when they come from poor countries to the US is how many choices we have of a given food. So for example, they often find themselves perplexed by the number of cereals or the number of different kinds of coffee, or how many yogurts there are in a supermarket. And it's this dizzying array of choices, whereas in other countries they have fewer choices, and that actually you would consider them being helped by that. Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So especially when you're referring to kids, does the desire for variety almost always override the texture consistency you talked about?
Okay, it's a good question. The question is, with kids especially, does the desire for variety override the other sensory properties that you might get from a high sugar or high fat food? These things are all working in competition with each other in some ways. It seems from the bare reality of the fact that the population's getting heavier and heavier and heavier, especially kids, that the things like the fat and the sugar are overriding the sensory-specific satiety. Now, the sensory-specific satiety would probably have a chance to kick in if there were a narrow range of high-fat, high-sugar choices, because then the kid would get tired of those particular things. But there are so many choices that the sensory-specific satiety probably never really has a chance to kick in. You see things like this happening in all parts of the world, so of course the food choices are really dizzying. Now, it's interesting how Frito-Lay marketed this particular product. So first on the package it says 8 vitamins and fortify with 8 vitamins and minerals, essential ones. Okay, now what do you guys think about that? Is this a reasonable thing for a company to do?
Yes.
Okay, why?
Because vitamins and minerals are good for you.
Okay. Okay, so one vote would be yes, this is okay, because vitamins and minerals are good if kids are going to eat it anyway, not throw some of them in. Okay, what about some other reactions to this? Yes?
You might not be able to absorb the vitamins if they're not from the natural source.
Okay, so maybe the body's not going to use these vitamins anyway, so what use are they? Yes?
Do you know who Dr. Kenneth Cooper is?
Yes, I'll talk about that in just a minute.
I was just curious.
Yes?
I say no, it's not good because you're probably gaining more harm than you are good.
Okay, so this comment was that this is probably not good because there's more harm, I'm assuming you mean from eating the high-calorie foods, than you get the good from coming from the vitamins and minerals. Okay, this is an interesting thing. Now, food companies do this a lot. They fortify foods. And there are cases where the fortification is a very good thing. For example, we mentioned before putting iodine in salt helps prevent certain deficiencies. Folic acid in certain things helps prevent birth deficiencies. So there's some examples of where fortification is a good public health move, and there's general consensus that it's a good idea. In this case, the vitamins and minerals don't need to be in there because A, American children for the most part are not vitamin and mineral deficient, and B, if you wanted to deliver more vitamins and minerals to American children, this would not be the vehicle you would choose. And so some critics of these kind of practices say that this is just pure base marketing to make what otherwise is not a very good food seem healthier than it really is, and it gives permission for parents to buy this. It says, yes, this is a good thing to buy because it's going to help your children. So that's what the critics would say. Now, over on the right-hand side, up there, you see that there's more permission giving. It says that kids will love this. Sorry, this is cut off, but it said this is something that both kids and mothers can love. And so it gives mothers permission to buy it. And it has all their favorite snacks in one bag. And then down here, you see that it's 8 vitamins and minerals again, no trans fat, and it's endorsed by Dr. Kenneth Cooper. Cooper is the father of aerobics. He's a physician who has a large practice in Dallas, a place called the Cooper Center. And he was really he was a cardiologist, still is a cardiologist, but he invented the concept of aerobics many, many years ago. But he's gotten into the nutrition field as well. Well, he started working with PepsiCo, which is the parent company to Frito-Lay. In fact, we'll have a terrific person from PepsiCo as one of our guest speakers later in the class, and he can talk about this sort of thing. But Cooper then gets paid as a consultant. I don't know how much, but he gets paid as a consultant and then issues his proclamation that this is somehow a healthier food. But if in fact kids are eating more of it and getting more calories, more fat, and more sugar than they would if they were just eating the regular old food, then this does seem like marketing that's ill-advised. Putting out a product and then marketing it as somehow healthy when kids might eat more of it is a problem. Okay, well, we did a little study on this that we haven't yet published, but we did a study where we brought kids into the lab. We found out which of these foods they liked the most and then gave them that versus the Munchies and see which they would eat more of. And you guys were exactly right. They didn't eat less of the Munchies, they didn't eat the same, but they ate more. And so this creates interesting issues with marketing and biology and the whole sensory-specific satiety idea. Okay, now I'd like to turn our attention to the effect of things like stress and a related concept on social position because a study came out recently on this. It was very interesting. There's been a lot of interest in the influence of stress on eating. And stress affects eating, as I mentioned before, in different ways. So let's just get a show of hands on this. If you're stressed, now most people when they're severely stressed, like things are really just out of control in your life, tend to eat less and eating is suppressed. But at more moderate levels of stress, the kind of things that you'd experience, you're studying for a tough exam, you got relationship issues going on, family things happening, or whatever it happens to be. How many of you under those conditions would say you eat more? And how many of you would say you eat less? Okay, so an interesting mix within this kind of class. And it's interesting that the preponderant response here was to eat more. And there's biology that affects that. Well, there was a graduate student working with me number of years ago named Alyssa Epple. Here's a picture of Alyssa, who's now on the faculty at the University of California, San Francisco. She looks like she's on TV at this point because that's a picture of her on TV. Anyway, Alyssa was a terrific young scholar working with us, and now has become the leading expert in the world on this particular topic. She got interested in why stress makes some people eat more and some people eat less. Depression does the same thing, by the way. And there are a number of interesting reasons why this might occur. What does stress actually do that would affect somebody's food intake? Well, it could stimulate hunger, so people just want to eat more. It could stimulate satiety, or suppress satiety, either one, depending on whether you eat more or less. It could affect the sensory, how you perceive food. So if you get a certain amount of pleasure from food X, pizza, let's say, or a donut or ice cream or whatever it happens to be, under non-stress conditions, the one hypothesis is that if you're stressed, your physiology changes so you derive more pleasure from those foods. It could be that the foods have a whole different biological effect than what I just mentioned, and that would be the ability to calm down this arousal that gets produced in people by feeling bad. So when you're stressed, your body is aroused. You've all heard of the fight or flight thing. Your body is aroused. That becomes an unpleasant state for most people. And one hypothesis is you eat the food and it calms that state down. It soothes you down and makes you feel better. And so Alyssa did a variety of studies to test these different hypotheses. And we're not going to talk too much about the results now because it would take a long time to discuss, but they're extremely interesting. And she found not only does stress affect biology through some of these mechanisms that we talked about, but also it affects things like what the body does with the nutrients that come in, and when they get stored on the body as body fat, where they happen to go. And there is, she has research showing that when eating is done under stress conditions, and there's a cortisol response that's related to stress, you'll learn more about that later, that the body is more likely to take that fat and store it in the abdominal region. And we'll come back and mention that again as we did before. A very interesting study related to this was published just a short time ago using monkeys at a well-known research facility in Atlanta called Yerkes. What these researchers wanted to do is look at social position within a group of monkeys, looking at the dominant monkeys in social groups versus the subordinate monkeys. And if those of you who've had any psychology will have heard about this kind of thing. And this is not an infrequently used measure of stress and how social position affects stress and therefore affects whatever outcome you're interested in. In this case, they were interested in eating. What they found here is that they compared females in this particular study and looked at the dominant versus subordinate ones. And both groups could eat all they wanted whenever they wanted because food was freely available. That's what the ad lib means. The subordinates ate less, but not a lot less than the dominant monkeys. And the researchers hypothesized that this might be due to the stress of being subordinate in the social group. But they were more or less maintaining a normal weight and able to function fine. But they then introduced high-fat, high-calorie foods to these animals and allowed both groups to eat ad lib, whatever they wanted, of the high-fat, high-calorie foods. And something very interesting happened at that point. The dominants ate a bit more of this food, but not an awful lot. But the subordinates ate much more, especially at night when they're not ordinarily eating. And the researchers, and of course gained weight as a consequence. And the researchers hypothesized that maybe the calorie-dense foods became a way to soothe the stress, to calm the arousal, and had much more reinforcing value for the subordinate animals because of the stress they were experiencing due to their social position. Very interesting study here. So here you get a different effect of introduction of a high-fat diet depending on where the organism is in the social position. Another interesting phenomenon that has to do with stress. So here would be a perfect example of how environment affects biology, which in turn affects eating. Let's talk a little bit about body composition. What does the body do with calories, And how does body weight get affected by these? And again, you're going to start to see both culture, which we'll talk about later, but you'll talk about things external to the body and things internal to the body having big impacts. But biology is a player, certainly, in how people regulate their body weight. So the fact is, if we took all of you and put you on exactly the same diet, the precise number of calories, the precise composition of the food, X carbohydrate, X fat, those sort of things, and you all exercised exactly the same amount, and we did this under very controlled circumstances, there would be large variations in what your body would do with those calories. And on a given calorie level, some of you might lose weight, some of you might gain weight, some of you would stay the same, and if you did a scatter plot of what would happen to your weight under identical conditions, there would be pretty large variability. That's all the biology that you're born with. Your biology determines, to a great extent, how your body handles calories, how efficiently it stores them, how it burns them off, how it wastes them through body heat, what it does with your basal metabolic rate that I'll describe in a moment, and the like. And this has been shown a number of ways. So weight is driven, as you know, by energy balance. It's calories in and calories out. Calories, as we mentioned before, are just a measure of energy, the unit of energy. And so if energy intake is different than energy expenditure, the difference is felt more or less, or most often, in the body fat stores. And that determines whether people lose or gain weight. And as you can imagine, energy balance is affected in the following way. If intake is less than expenditure, weight loss occurs. So this is, of course, where hunger and starvation come in. Weight gain occurs under these conditions, and you have stable weight if intake and expenditure line up. Now, you have problems with the top two features here in different parts of the world, overnutrition in some parts, undernutrition in others. And it's the energy balance that's helping drive the weight itself. So let's talk about metabolism for a minute. The word metabolism comes up a lot. There are metabolism diets. People say, I have fast metabolism. You have slow metabolism. People use that word a lot. What does it mean? Well, metabolism is essentially the term that describes how your body handles energy. When you consume food, metabolic processes occur that then are pertaining to the way your body is handling the incoming energy, the incoming nutrients, and all of this is our metabolic processes, and metabolism is the end product of that. And so this would be, this particular chart here shows calories people burn, the energy expenditure part of the energy balance equation. So how many calories are you burning just sitting there? If you stand up, would you burn more calories? If you walked across the room, would you burn more? If you ran a marathon, how many would you burn? How many calories is your body burning just by virtue of being alive? These are all parts of the energy balance equation, part of energy expenditure. So let's look at the left-hand side of this bar, and we're going to see how it all partitions. So what this particular bar shows is that this might be typical energy expenditure for an average person. So say 2,000 calories a day. Now, by the way, that's why when you see the dietary recommendations that the average person eat about 2,000 calories a day, it would be in balance. You're burning as much as you eat. You're not going to gain weight. Okay, so the pieces of this. First, BMR, basal metabolic rate. That's how many calories, how much energy your body is using just to function. So your cells are dividing, your heart is beating, your blood is pumping. There's some movement that occurs, even if you're being pretty sedentary, and it's just the body's need to function is the basal metabolic rate. And you can see that of the 2,000 calories, that constitutes a lot of it. Now, the sleeping metabolic rate, which is less than the basal metabolic rate, is how much energy you're burning during sleep. Okay, so you'd be burning less during sleep because, of course, you're not being as active and the body doesn't need as much energy. This TEF is called the thermic effect of food. When you eat a meal or you eat any food, your body takes in the calories and makes use of it, But it requires bodily processes to do that, and those bodily processes require energy for your stomach to work, your intestines to work, and the like. So that accounts for a little bit of the energy expenditure, but not a lot. And the SPA is spontaneous physical activity. So you can see from this graph that not an awful lot of the calories that people burn overall are driven by how physically active they are. Now, being physically active is terribly important with regulation of the balance of energy, so it's really important. But as important, or even much more important, is the biology people are born with that affects things like their basal metabolic rate. And that's why all of you on exactly the same diet, exactly the same exercise plan, would not have the same thing happen to your weights, because of the differences in things like basal metabolic rate. Some people are very efficient with their calories, as we mentioned before. They consume calories, a certain amount of calories. The body doesn't waste them through heat and by unnecessary metabolic processes. They store those calories into body fat when it becomes more than the body needs. Other people are less efficient with calories. They're consuming calories, but their body is wasting them, if you will. Now, wasting the calories through high-level metabolic processes is a good thing in a culture of abundance, but it's a bad thing if starvation is a factor in one's life. Then you want to be as efficient with the calories as possible. And so overall, the amount of physical activity people get as a function of overall energy expenditure is not as much as you might think. But important, very important. I don't want to underplay that, but these other factors are very important as well in determining what people weigh. So if we look at energy expenditure components, they change depending on whether a person is physically active. So we look at the three major things: the thermic effect of food, which is a small part, the energy expenditure from physical activity, and then resting energy expenditure, which is essentially the basal metabolic rate. For a sedentary person that might burn 1,800 calories a day, the partitioning will look like this, but for somebody who's more physically active and might burn 400 more calories a day, say by walking 4 miles, running 4 miles, or doing other things, the partitioning would look like this. And so the expenditure, the orange part of the circles here from physical activity goes up a lot, by 400 calories to be precise, but it also becomes a greater percentage of the overall energy expenditure picture, and that's why being physically active is such a good idea. We'll talk about body composition as well. Weight is one index of how healthy people are, but also how much body fat they have is important as well. And that varies, so you can have people at a given weight who vary a lot in their amount of body fat. So it's the relative amount of fat in lean body tissue. Lean body tissue is the combination of muscle, bones, and organs, but people usually refer to lean body mass as muscle because that's the most important thing that you have some control over. And then that compares to body fat. So percent body fat, of course, would be a person weighs 100 pounds, and if 30% of it is fat, then their percent body fat is 30%. There are different ways of measuring body fat. 3 of the primary ones are by looking at body fat skin folds, by weighing people underwater, and by using a device called the DEXA machine. Here's what they look like. The DEXA machine on the bottom. The top left is measuring body fat with skin folds, through skin folds. And there's a device called skin fold calipers that you see a researcher there using on a part of the back there, where a pinch of body fat is made. The thickness of it is measured with the calipers. That's done on several places in the body. And then you can use equations to figure out from that, estimate from that, how much body fat a person actually has. The most precise way, the gold standard of measuring this, is to weigh people underwater, which is what you see in the upper left. So a person sits on a chair, is submerged in water for just a very short time, and their body fat can get estimated from that because lean tissue and fat tissue have different densities, and that can be determined through calculations. So, but of course you can imagine how this is difficult to do with large numbers of people, and if you have to have the right equipment. The same would be true of the DEXA machine, which provides a pretty good estimate of body fat as well, but that requires lots of money and things like that. And even doing skinfold calipers, which doesn't require the expensive equipment, requires time and training. And so if you're doing a large population study, say with thousands and thousands of people, that becomes a barrier. So you can see why most studies just measure body weight in people, even if they're just reporting it themselves, rather than measuring body fat. And then those measures get put into this thing called the body mass index. So let's talk now about what that is. There's been the need to develop an approximation of body fat, because body fat, percent body fat, is a stronger predictor of health than body weight is. Because with body weight you get false positives and false negatives, as I'll describe in a moment. But you can't measure body fat all the time because it costs too much, it's too difficult. And so the body mass index was developed, and what it is, it's an equation that takes weight and height and puts them together into a number that is then becomes a health standard. And the number is an estimate of how much body fat people have. Or it's not an estimate of percent body fat, but it better reflects body fat than if all you know about somebody is their weight. So if you get somebody's height and your weight, you create the body mass index, which is weight, in this case expressed in kilograms, divided by height squared, expressed as meters. And then you come away with numbers that usually range from, 12, 13 at the very low end, up into the 60s or even higher at the very high end. And in this particular graphic, you see what the classifications are for underweight, normal weight, and overweight with body mass index. Now you guys have probably heard of this concept, you've seen charts with it, you may have calculated your own body mass index. There are plenty of places you can do that on the web, and you can get a sense therefore about what this means. And so this is a better measure than just body fat. Now body fat and body composition are usually alike, but not always. And so that's where you get the false positives and false negatives. So for example, you can get an exception like this football player, for example, and if all you knew was his weight, you would assume the guy weighs too much, but he's very heavily muscled, so that would be a false positive for obesity, let's say. And so you can have cases where weight can be good, but body composition is bad, so that would mean somebody is actually normal weight, but they're in bad physical condition, they don't have much muscle, and they have more fat than would be optimal. And of course you can have the opposite, where weight could appear to be bad, but body composition is actually good. So that's why you need something that is an estimate of body fat. Here is a graph that shows the relationship between body mass index and actual body fat measured by something like underwater weighing. So you get a large sample of people in this particular study. Each dot represents a subject in here, and you take their body mass index just by knowing their height and weight, and you see how carefully it represents body fat. And so the women are in the lighter colored, the orange colored squares, and the men are in the blue colored ovals. And the lines here show that several things. So this is the average for the women, the line that goes right through there. This would be the average for the men that goes through there. And what you see is a pretty nice relationship that as body mass index increases, body fat increases as well. And if this were a perfect predictor, if body mass index were a perfect estimator of body fat, you'd see an exactly straight line that would go at an angle right like this, but it would be straight. So these lines are almost straight, but there's some curve in them. So it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. You can see here that women have more body fat than men. That's a natural thing, and I'll describe that in a minute. And also there is some variability in these things. So let's just take a couple of data points as an example. Now let's see. So let's look at the squares for women that you see in the circles. So here would be a case of individual subjects in this study who have the same body mass index but have much different body fat. And so this shows that there's some error in this, that it's not a perfect measure of body fat, because two women who have body mass index of about 20, which is in the healthy range, have as little as about 12% body fat or as much as 40. So this would be examples of somebody whose weights are about the same at a given height, but they're in different kind of physical conditions. So there's some error there. There's also error in this direction where you'd have two people with the same amount of body fat but would have a different body mass index, and they're quite different from one another. So there are different errors in this, but for the most part, body mass index is about the best predictor we have, short of doing physiological assessment of what body fat really is in people. A few composition facts about body composition. As I said, women naturally have more body fat than men. That is probably due to the need to preserve energy for pregnancy and lactation. I mentioned that before. Strength training increases muscle mass in the body, and that changes body composition, even if the amount of fat stays the same. Muscle is more metabolically active than fat, so it takes more energy for the body to deal with a pound of muscle than it does with a pound of body fat. So that's why things like strength training become a very good idea if one's concerned about body weight regulation. It's good for lots of different reasons, but that would be one of them. Normal body fat is about 15 to 17% of body weight for men, 20 to 25% body fat for women would be the typical range. And as I mentioned before, men and women tend to store weight in different parts of the body. And you have the apple and the pear shape. And as I also mentioned before, there are exceptions to this rule, and when people gain enough weight, they tend to gain weight all over the body. But when people begin gaining weight, it's more likely for women to distribute it below the waist, men above the waist. There's good and bad news for both men and women in this. The good news for the men is that the weight stored above the waist seems more readily mobilized when people go on a diet. And the bad news is that it's worse for your health to have the weight stored in that part of the body. For the women, the weight stored below the waist is more difficult to mobilize. It's protected more heavily by the body. It's defended, if you will. But the good news is that it's not going to create risk for disease as much as the excess weight stored above the waist. And so, as I mentioned before, the reason that people think this is the case is that the fat below the waist is a storage depot for energy in preparation for pregnancy, for all the energy needed to sustain a pregnancy and then to feed the child, breastfeed the child after that. So the female is burning tremendous number of calories doing these sort of things, as you might imagine, and that is the part of the body where the fat for that purpose has the energy stored. And so because the reproduction is such an important function to defend, that the body defends that weight in particular compared to the apple shape that might occur above the waist. So a very interesting part of biology of that. Let's talk about genes and body weight. How much is body weight affected by genes? Well, it's affected a lot by behavior, of course, how much one eats. It's affected a lot by culture. I mean, we've got rampant things like obesity in the United States. You've got almost none of it in a country like Somalia. But then biology is also an important player potentially. So I'd like to have you guys do a little vote with your clickers. And I'd like you to estimate, now somebody responded already before I've described the question, but maybe it doesn't matter. Okay, how much of the variation in body weight in a population is explained by genetics? Now that doesn't mean, and so 0 to 25% doesn't mean that 25% of people who are overweight because of genetic reasons. But what it means is that in a population that either weighs a lot or a little, how much is driven by genetics? And as weight varies within a population, how much is driven by genetics? So do you think it's 0 to 25%, which would mean genetics are having a pretty small contribution, 25 to 40, 40 to 70, or 70 to 100, that would mean genetics is having a very strong contribution to body weight. Okay. So let's see, everybody done voting? Okay, let's see what your graph says. Okay, 14% of you said 0 to 25%. The majority, or more than anything else, said 25 to 40, 40 to 70, 39%, and then a few said 70 to 100%. So most of you are clustered in the middle somewhere. Well, let's see what the number really is. There are several prominent researchers who have done studies on genetics and body weight. And you'll hear some of them referred to later in the class, and I'm going to show a video clip today that has one of the figures interviewed. This is Rudy Leibel, who is a very well-known physician researcher at Columbia University who has studied this. This is Albert Stunkard at the University of Pennsylvania, who did the initial human genetic studies on body weight regulation, and Claude Bouchard is at a place called the Pennington Institute, and he's one of the world leaders on these as well. So I'm going to show you some data from studies that these folks and others have done. There are different methods for studying the genetic contribution to anything. And so if you're interested in how much genes contribute to hair color, to depression, to schizophrenia, to heart disease, to cancer, or to body weight regulation, these are the kind of methods that typically get used. First, you can do animal studies where you can actually go in and measure genes. You can do that in humans, of course, too. Or you can manipulate genes by breeding animals to be a certain way. You'll see some examples of that. You can do family studies to see how much certain things cluster in families. So let's just say you look to see whether, if parents are overweight, whether they're more or less likely to have overweight children. And so you can see the clustering in families. Now, that's easy to do from a research point of view, but has weaknesses as well, as you can imagine, because the families also share culture and environment, not just the biology. Adoption studies are an interesting issue here as well. And that's when you look at people adopted versus their biological relatives who are not, identical and fraternal twins, twins reared together and apart, and then of course you can go in and do gene studies. Now I'd like to describe a couple of these. First, there are ways you can breed obesity. In this case, there's a laboratory strain of mice called the OB mouse that's bred to be obese. So you can look at the genes that are doing this. Here are more examples of that kind of thing. These have been used for years in laboratory studies. And I'd like to show you this little video clip. In this case, Rudolf Leibel, the researcher I mentioned, is interviewed, but it talks a little bit about this issue, about biology.
Scientists are also attacking the problem of obesity at its most basic genetic level, and have already transformed fat rats into lean rats by gene manipulation.
From mice and rats, we have learned that there are single genes that can cause very profound obesity. And we have found in every instance that there is a corresponding gene in humans. So if we went out in the street right now and I showed you a group of adults with heights ranging from 4.5 feet to 6.5 or 7 feet, you would make no comment about this. It's expected. We all expect to see wide variation in height. We accept that this is due to very strong genetic influences. My perception of this is that there are equally potent genetic influences on body weight as there are on height, but the population, because of our lack of understanding of all the mechanisms, simply has not come to accept this yet.
So interesting here that he talks about cultural perceptions, that we accept the fact that height is very genetically determined, but less so with weight because of the way we've been trained to think about this issue. But in fact, biology is an important player. One of the first studies done with humans on this was done by Stunkard, one of the researchers I mentioned before, in the country of Denmark. Denmark keeps very careful records of adoptees, and for research reasons keeps track of people who are adopted later in their life, and also the parents who raised them and the parents who gave birth to them, the biological versus adoptive parents. And Stunkard, collaborating with Danish researchers, was able to look at these adoptees, people who were adopted at birth, and then as adults, how much they weighed, and look to see whether their weights were more closely resembled those of their biological parents or the parents who raised them. And if the relationship was strong between the adoptees' adult weights and the parents who raised them, it would be a strong argument for culture and environment. If the relationship is stronger with the biological parents, of course, then it would argue for genes. And so the results look like this. If we look at the right first, the relationship between weights of the children and their mothers and fathers, their adoptive mothers and fathers, as the weights increase here from thin to the median level to overweight and obese, you don't see a very clear relationship, because as the adoptees are getting heavier, the parents aren't necessarily heavier. So this would suggest that there's not a very strong relationship between the parents who raise the children and the weights of the adoptees, whereas you get a different picture for the biological parents. As the weights are going up in the adoptees, the weights of the biological parents are higher too, even though there had never been any contact after birth. So this would be a strong argument for biology. Another very interesting way of looking at this is comparing monozygotic and dizygotic twins, identical twins versus fraternal twins. So of course, twins born at the same time to the same parents, raised in the same environment. But the monozygotic twins, the identical twins, share all their genetic material. The dizygotic twins share half of their genetic material. So you can look at how the weights of twin pairs relate to each other, how the twins relate to each other in weight. And if biology is a player, you'd expect a stronger relationship for the monozygotic twins than the dizygotic. And in fact, that's what you find. This is a picture showing twin pairs of dizygotic twins. So twins born same time to the same parents but share half their genetic materials, and each panel here shows one pair of twins. So this would be one pair, another pair, etc. And you can really see pretty striking differences in some in height, but also in the amount of body fat, and also other physical characteristics. So you see big differences here, you see big differences here, etc. And then if you look at a picture that shows monozygotic twins who share all their genetic material, then what you tend to get are mirror images of one another. So it's another method of estimating the genetic contributions to this issue. So genes are a player, to be sure. I'm going to skip over this and conclude about some of the genetics. Those of you who voted for 25 to 40% were correct. That is the amount of variance in the population that you can explain by genetics. Now the question is that a lot or a little? Depends on your perspective. If the culture believes that body weight is completely under personal control or driven by environmental factors, then hearing this number sounds like a lot. That the biology is really a player. We weren't expecting it to be that way. But on the other hand, this means that less than half of the explanation of population body weight is biological and genetic. And there's at least 60% and as much as 75% left over to be explained by cultural type factors. So it depends on your perspective. But here are some of the conclusions that people have raised, putting genetics and body weight together. Genetic influences largely determine whether a person can become obese, but it is the environment that determines whether a person does become obese and the extent of that obesity. And then another similar quote, genes load the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. So you may have very little obesity in a country like Somalia where starvation and famine become real issues, but if their environment became like ours, then genetics might determine how much weight an individual would gain, but the environment would determine whether the whole population is gaining weight. We'll come back and talk about culture and environment later. So I'd like to end with a discussion of something on taste aversions, because this also is a very interesting phenomenon that has to do with the way our body handles food. How many of you have a strong aversion to at least some food? Okay, most of you said yes. Now my guess is that if we had you write down what those foods are, it would be highly different from one another, because these things tend to get conditioned in by happenstance. You tend to eat a certain food, and when you're sick, the body then doesn't want you to eat that food anymore. And there's a good evolutionary reason for that, of course, because in nature, if you eat something that makes you sick, it means that it's not good for you, and there's potentially toxins and poison in that, and so you want to avoid that food as much as possible. A very interesting example of this was done with coyotes and sheep. In the western part of the US, the sheep farmers are plagued by coyotes eating the sheep. And this becomes a real problem for them. So the question is, how do you control this process? And the farmers and the sheep farmers and the animal protection people don't like each other so much, because the farmers want to kill the coyotes and the animal protection people don't want this to happen. So a psychological researcher came up with a very interesting way to deal with this, having to do with food aversions. And what they did was they took sheep, like carcasses of dead sheep that the coyotes would ordinarily eat, and lace the carcass with lithium chloride, which when eaten by the coyotes would make them very sick. It wouldn't kill them, but it would make them throw up and be nauseous and feel terrible and all kinds of stuff like that. And what they found then is the coyotes wouldn't eat the sheep anymore. The same kind of food aversion that you guys may have experienced got drilled into the coyotes by this particular aversive experience. And there are videotapes, I tried to get one, but I couldn't find one, of coyotes coming up to baby lambs and running away whimpering as if that little lamb was going to do something terrible to them because of this aversion. So you can see how strong the biology becomes. Okay, so we will see you guys on Monday. Don't forget to turn in your concept sheets outside the room.